Conflict and Communication. Week 1, Course Introduction. Core Concepts. This video provides an overview of conflict and communication, two core concepts that we will explore in this course. This is just a basic overview, mainly to give a sense of how these concepts will be discussed. We will obviously be looking at them in more depth. By the end of this video, you should be able to compose a working definition of conflict, in your own words, discuss the relationship between conflict and communication, and in your own words, discuss why communication competence is a key element of effective conflict work. Conflict. We've already established that conflict has two potentials. It can be destructive, or dysfunctional, but it can also be constructive, or functional. Although, in reality, things are a bit more complex, with most conflicts demonstrating both functional and dysfunctional elements. Let's go a bit deeper. I'll be drawing upon the work of two theorists, Johan Galtung, who's commonly associated with peace studies, and Jean-Paul Lederach, who many of the folks who are in the Conflict Resolution Studies program may have heard or read about. Now, Galtung suggests that all conflicts have three main aspects. The first is behavior. These are the overt things that we see, the way people talk to each other, what they say, what they do. However, while people often focus on this, there's really far more going on. It's basically just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. Equally important are our attitudes and perceptions. That is, the way that the different parties in a conflict perceive themselves, each other, and the conflict itself. Does each party see the other as evil, stupid, morally wrong, or as a potential collaborator and dialogue partner? This has a lot to do with how people perceive themselves and the situation. The last aspect of conflict is, well, the core issues that are at play. Conflict isn't just about perceptions, it's also about real issues, scarce resources, deep notions of identity, often extremely important real things that need to be dealt with. So that's conflict. Attitudes plus behaviors plus core ideas, or A, B, C. All of these facets influence each other. Attitudes affect behaviors, the nature of an issue can affect attitudes, etc. Now, both Galtung and Lederach also suggest that we need to look at conflict through a multi-level approach. This means that we need to see how conflict is related to and embedded within relationships and contexts. First, we need to consider the relationship between the parties in conflict, particularly if this relationship is characterized by inequitable power. We also need to remember, however, that these relationships are further shaped by broader institutional, cultural, social, economic, and political contexts. And all of these contexts have a history, as does the relationship between the parties. Even if you're in conflict with someone you've just met, the absence of previous encounters is a history. Further, the conflict itself has a history. We'll talk about how conflict escalates and de-escalates. Our attitudes also have a history, being shaped by past experience and the conflict dynamics. Even our behaviors have a history, often becoming more harmful as conflicts escalate. Plus, our current conflict behaviors are often based upon what's worked for us in the past. Switching over to Lederach, he suggests then that an instance of conflict, what he would call an episode of conflict, provides a window into these deeper patterns of relationship in history, or what he would call the epicenter of a conflict. In this manner, a conflict situation, a conflict episode that is, can be used to instigate or catalyze change in relationships and contexts. So there you have it. ABCs, a window, episodes, and epicenters. Now, please pause the video and take a moment to reflect. How would you define conflict? I mean, in your own words. How would you construct a definition that includes some of the elements we've talked about, plus your own experiences and past knowledge? Pause this video and take a moment to make a few notes for yourself. Communication. Often folks assume that communication is a linear process. That is, there is a clear sender and a clear receiver. The sender sends a message, and perhaps the receiver sends feedback. This is based off of older scholarship and conceptual models of communication. In this course, communication will be conceptualized as a constant, ongoing process of creating meaning through the sending, receiving, decoding, and interpreting of messages between two or more parties. Once again, communication will be conceptualized as a constant, ongoing process of creating meaning through the sending, receiving, decoding, and interpreting of messages between two or more parties. This draws upon the transactional model of communication proposed by Dean Barland in 1970. This model assumes that in a given communication exchange, it's actually very difficult, if not impossible, to identify a clear sender and receiver. Rather, both are communicators, and both are constantly sending messages back and forth. These messages can be sent verbally, that is through a particular linguistic symbol system, like spoken language or sign language, or the messages can be sent non-verbally, things like hand gestures, eye contact, and laughing. All of these also send messages. And all of these messages have two dimensions, a content dimension and a relational dimension. The content dimension includes the more overt message being communicated. The relational dimension indicates how the communicator feels about the person with whom they are communicating. Think of all the different ways you can tell someone thank you and the different relational messages you can send depending on how you change your tone of voice and your nonverbal behavior. Okay, so we have two communicators constantly sending messages back and forth. Both of these communicators have their own personal biographies, their own past and current experiences, all of which are shaped by things like culture, age, and social location. This personal biography is called the field of experience. This includes everything that may impact how an individual engages in and interprets the messages that they receive. In theory, the more the fields of experience between communicators overlap, the smoother the communication interaction will be. Consider, for example, language. If two communicators share the same language, which would be part of their shared field of experience, this would most likely make for a faster, smoother interaction. In theory, at least. Moving on, there are several factors which may impede the ability of either communicator to properly receive, decode, and interpret the messages they are sent. These barriers are called noise. These can be further broken down into three types. External noise is any distraction occurring within the physical environment that again might impede your ability to receive, decode, or interpret a given message. This can include things like being in a loud or crowded room, or even something like a television that's on in the background. That could still be distracting, even if it's muted. So again, that would still be considered a form of external noise. Psychological noise includes any kind of internal distraction, like the thoughts that we all have constantly running through our heads. Physiological noise includes any kind of physiological issue, like hearing loss, that might make communication more challenging in some situations. So now we have communicators sending messages within fields of experience and being impacted by noise. Going a little further, we can also see that the communicators are in a relationship, the dynamic of which will also influence the way in which they interact. And this relationship exists within broader institutional, social, cultural, economic, and political contexts. And as you may guess, both the relationship and the context have a history. Now, take a minute and pause this video, and in your own words, see if you can write down a few points that discuss the relationship between conflict and communication. How does communication influence conflict? How does conflict influence communication? Take a few moments, pause the video, and jot a few notes for yourself. Now I want to close by going back to this notion of communication competence. We've already talked about communication competence as the ability to balance effectiveness and appropriateness in our communication. We've also discussed how this relates to particular cognitive, affective, and kinesthetic capacities. These include cognitive complexity, motivation and empathy, being very skilled, adaptable, open mindedness, perspective taking, self reflection, and self monitoring. Now, looking at this, how might the development of communication competence improve our ability to handle conflict effectively? In fact, pause the video now and, in your own words, consider why communication competence is a key element of effective conflict work. Take a few moments to reflect. This video provided an overview of conflict and communication, two core concepts that we will explore in this course. You should be able to compose a working definition of conflict, in your own words, discuss the relationship between conflict and communication, and in your own words, discuss why communication competence is a key element of effective conflict work.